Well, welcome everybody. We're looking at the Sermon in Nazareth, chapter 4 of Luke, a manifesto for mission, and then the calling of the disciples in chapter 5, a pattern for discipleship. But we're starting with the homework from last week, where we noted that Luke follows Mark from chapter 4 onwards in chapter 8 of Luke. So the left-hand column, the bold, the kind of the orange sections are those that are found in the same order, basically, almost the same order, but recognizably the same story in Luke. And then we get to the death of John the Baptist, which Luke leaves out. And then on the right-hand column, the return of the apostles, and that's in larger print here, and the feeding of the 5,000. Both of those are in Mark. But then there's a whole lot of, both of those are in Luke, I'm sorry. But then there's a whole lot of stories that Mark has from the end of chapter 6 through to late in chapter 8, from the walking on the sea through to the healing of a blind man using spittle, before Luke immediately resumes with, who do you say that I am? So Luke jumps from the feeding of the 5,000 to the question, who do you say that I am? And leaves out those stories. And it'll be interesting to see what responses come, because this is one of the things about which I think there's no clear consensus in scholarship. There's nothing that I or Elizabeth are going to say, this is why, full stop. But there are all sorts of ideas and hypotheses about why those stories might have been left out. So who would like to start with some suggestions? Why do you think Luke has left these passages out? What's their significance?
It was suggested in one of the readings that I did outside the list that you gave us that omitted because he was going to use that material either directly or indirectly in his second volume, Acts of the Apostles. And it's interesting that, for instance, the feeding of the 4,000 is clearly a Gentile feeding, and some of the other stories or some of the other stories have a similar slant to them.
Mm.
John, could it be some of his audience he was preaching or talking to?
That's always possible, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's highly likely that the when you tell people stories, you tell them the things that you think they will be interested in, that they will connect to.
Mm.
If you're a good storyteller, if you're a bad storyteller, you just waffle on and lose people. But yeah, it's interesting though that I think I've got my head together around this, but I'm not absolutely certain. It's not until Luke chapter 5 that Luke actually says Jesus performed some miracles. The calling was actually before Luke says anything about the healings and the whatever. He's calling people on the basis. He's saying that Jesus called people called the disciples earlier in the process, I guess, than not. Although they responded to a miracle, clearly it wasn't. Yeah. It was a miracle from a teacher rather than a miracle from a miracle worker, a known miracle worker. Is that got that right, or am I confused, John? I could.
There's stories in chapter 4 of Luke which come from Mark about Jesus casting out an unclean spirit from a man, healing Simon's mother-in-law. Those who were sick with various kinds of diseases came to him and he laid hands and cured them, and demons came out of many. So there's exorcisms and healings in chapter 4.
But the other question would be, are we dealing with the Jewish society or the Gentile society?
You're probably dealing with a mixed society, Mary, but there'd be a large proportion of Gentiles included in that.
Right? It's not that they're omitted, it's just that he's added them. So maybe he's using a different source at this point.
Or they don't suit his theology.
Yeah, but Mark came first. So Mark obviously he's made a choice not to include certain aspects in his gospel. So Luke comes along 30 years later, and he's using a different source as well.
I think he just wanted to blow his readers away with, so many incredible examples of miracles and healings.
Possibly.
Mark did, yeah.
Yeah,
Luke.
Mark. But I mean, Luke, we know we've got Mark, so we've got that source. So we know Luke omits bits of Mark. We know that.
We're
And the
assuming
reason
that the
is
version
why.
we're assuming that the version of Mark we have is the version of Mark that Luke was using.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
that's a reasonable assessment given that Matthew produces much of the
Right.
version of Mark
Yeah.
we have. So the question is, why did Luke leave those things out that he had in front of him when he made his orderly account?
But did he have them in front of him?
Well, he probably did because they're in Mark. That's the point.
Yeah,
Did he have them? Yeah, actually, there's verbatims, fairly significant verbatim passages, aren't
That's
there?
right. Yes, there
I
are.
was about to say he may have just remembered, known about it, but there's the verbatim passages suggest that he probably actually did have something in front of him that he could copy or knew it off by heart pretty flipping well.
Well, he
which,
might have.
but anyhow, it's yeah. So
I think it's a much harder hypothesis to prove, Bill, that he had some different version of Mark when he copies the Mark chapters that he does use quite closely.
Sorry, I must apologise. I wasn't here last week, so I was misreading the chart.
Okay.
The Mark for the Luke. Yeah, me too.
Maybe he did something. He did research and found that it didn't really. He had no proof that these things happened, so he left it out.
Given there's no proof that half of what Luke claims happened, I think that's probably unlikely, Henrietta, but, always possible.
So leaving out the feeding of the 4,000 might be understandable from an editor's point of view. Haven't we already had a story about this just recently, the feeding of the 5,000? Why do we need to go through the whole rigmarole again? Let's just cut that out. That'll save space on the papyrus, and I can add in other stories that I want to. That might be a hypothesis.
The 4,000 is important as far as Mark's concerned because it's showing that Jesus had a message for the Gentiles as well as for the Jews.
Yeah.
Which of course is an important theme for Luke.
Yeah.
So it's curious that it's gone.
Yeah.
The story about the traditions of the elders, the washing of hands, the cleanliness notion, the holiness notion, which leads to the healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter and the healing of the deaf mute, all of that in chapter 7. All of that is about the change that Jesus brings to who is part of the people of God. The Mark story is where Mark says that Jesus declared that all foods are clean. That's actually a big issue for Luke in his second volume. Chapter 10 of Acts tells about Peter having the vision. If Peter had this vision and was so stunned by it that all foods are clean, if he had that vision after having been with Jesus in chapter 7 of Mark, where Jesus said all foods are clean, wouldn't we think Peter was a bit of a dumbhead? Anyway, Luke makes a big thing of it because he tells the story in great length, 48 verses in chapter 10. And then he has Peter and others go immediately to Jerusalem and tell the church in Jerusalem another 20 or something or other verses.
But Peter was a bit of a dumbhead. He
was, yes.
Gentiles turned up in Jericho. Was it not at Jericho? He stopped eating with the Gentiles and started eating with the Jewish people from Jerusalem.
Well, that's in Paul's letter. That's Paul's opinion of Peter and what he's describing. It's probably not Act's opinion.
But Mark presents the disciples as quite slow learners.
Yes.
I think probably Luke just does it in a different way.
They all step up to the plate in Acts. Something happens to them. Pentecost, perhaps, changes things because they. It'd be a bit mean to call them dudheads in Acts because they're not.
Do you want to talk about the last miracle in this section, Elizabeth, the healing of the blind man with spittle?
Yes.
Well, Luke might have left that out.
Matthew leaves this out as well, and I think that tells us something about what's going on. In part of my degree at Macquarie University, I did papyrus and I studied the magical papyrus. And it's clear that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is following the formula used by magicians and healers as set down in the magical papyrus. As he was accused of being a sorcerer in and the Gospel of Matthew records he's called a planos, a sorcerer or a deceiver. Luke and Matthew have probably omitted or modified this story greatly down to just a single sentence saying Jesus healed people, because they know it's controversial. They know that Jesus to be seen as some sort of magician, given the claims that have been made about him, is very controversial and probably not, conducive to what they want to convey in their gospel. So both of them leave this story out as it's told. So that's probably the reason why that one's not there, because it's far too magical. And we can't have that, can we? Because Jesus wasn't magical. He was doing things for another reason.
And another possibility, the story that comes before that, the criticism of the Pharisees and linking them with Herod. In Luke's gospel, there are a number of scenes in which Pharisees are portrayed in a positive light. There's certainly Jesus criticizes the Pharisees in Luke 11 and other places, but there are other scenes where Jesus is actually in the house of a Pharisee eating, having a meal with them, in chapter 7 of Luke and chapter 14 of Luke. So maybe Luke is leaving out something that is perhaps excessively negative of the Pharisees in his view, because he wants to present a different nuanced picture. Anyway, these are all hypotheses, and it's interesting to explore, but it's leading us into the question about what's going on in Luke's mind as he works with this material. And what we're going to do today is focus on two passages where I think we're able to get a bit more of a handle on what Luke is doing. And so you should have in your material the synopsis, the parallel passages, but we're going to start with the story in Luke 4, and you might like to have Luke 4 in front of you and then flip over to Mark 6, which is the parallel in Mark's gospel. And we're going to go into small groups to discuss these questions. What comes before this story in Luke's gospel, Jesus going to his hometown and speaking in the synagogue? What comes before the story in Luke's gospel? Just have a look at what precedes it. What comes before this story in Mark's gospel?
Temptation.
Where is it in the structure of Mark's gospel? And do you think that this is the same visit reported by Mark or Luke? Why do you think that? Or why do you not think that? That's our starting point into thinking about this story.
How long would you like people in groups?
I think 6 minutes.
Okay.
And if there are people that you don't know in the group, introduce yourself to each other briefly and then plunge into the question.
Okay, how did you go in your rooms? Is there some things you'd like to share about what was going on before Mark and before Luke?
Well, Luke more or less goes straight from his baptism to Nazareth. The storyline goes, although he does say in one sentence, the very first sentence in chapter 4 talks about him returning to Galilee and preaching in Galilee, but he doesn't say exactly what he was doing. He just rushes on to Nazareth. With Mark, he spent quite a lot of time going around Galilee.
This is where I thought we were in my earlier comment. At this stage,
all right. Yeah.
Luke has Jesus not having done any miracles.
Yeah,
he just comes in and does the teaching. It's not the call. It's this thing in the.
Yeah. But so Luke's introduction to the adult Jesus is that he's a preacher.
Yes.
Yes.
That's all. And then the miracles come later on. Yeah.
I was intrigued, Elizabeth, by, and I mentioned this in the group, in Mark, the focus is on the people in the synagogue, and in Luke, the focus is on the scripture that is being read. A little bit later on, in Mark, all the people took offense at what Jesus had said, whereas in Luke, all the people spoke well of him. And I'm thinking there's a little bit of political toing and froing here in terms of where these two guys are coming from in their understanding of what's happening in this period of time.
I think that's a really good observation, Gary, because clearly in Luke, you've got a prophetic fulfillment being pronounced about a messianic figure.
Yep.
And they don't get angry with him until he goads them.
Yep.
With, talking about God is there for the Gentiles more than for them. And that makes them probably understandably angry. And that, of course, isn't in Mark. They just think he's got a bit above his station in life. And they get angry about that. So I think that's right. So looking at the purpose of each gospel writer, I think probably unpacks that a bit. I don't know if John wants to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the comment in verse 5 of Mark 6:5 is that he could do no deed of power there, except heal perhaps a few sick people. And what's happened in Mark before this is lots and lots of healings, exorcisms, as well as teachings of Jesus. And that's sort of a key thing in the Markan account of this story. Whereas in Luke, as Judy's indicated, there's nothing before it about miracles and there's no reference to miracles. It's about the teaching and the interpretation of the scripture and the application.
So is this a school of thought in terms of the North and the South at the time?
I'm surprised at the economy of Mark in the sections that we read, 6:1 to 5, and really strikes a note with me. In the hometown that I grew up in, Warrnambool, I wrote a letter to the paper after I first went to university, first ever in 1,000 years in our family, and got attacked by my father's employer, basically saying, "Could this kid from such a background have such a view?" And it was about Vietnam, which turned out to be, of course, historically the correct view. They're all dead now, so I can't sort of dance on their grave. But it's a very common thing in our lives that we get put down because how could we possibly be any good if our family was just an average mob? And that the economy is saying that, and it's such a strong put down. And the last line there at 6:6, and he was amazed at their unbelief.
Yes.
Whereas in Luke, he elaborates, as someone else said earlier, quite rightly, and really focuses on really turns the focus onto the scripture and on, as Elizabeth just said, onto the whole messianic thing. And it sort of loses its impact about this, who's this upstart? Where did he come from? And, that seems to me, with Mark being closest in time to the event and all those things that we're talking about, that I get more of a hit out. I get more of an identification and a hit, a delivery of what I think I should be getting from Mark than I do. I get more confused by Luke.
Well, so Mark introduces isn't this just the carpenter's son, with the question, where did he get all of this? What wisdom does he think he's been given? So I'm entirely skeptical. Whereas the same kind of thing in Luke isn't this Joseph's son? Wow, listen to what he's saying. How amazing. A very different take on
which, and one's a positive and one's a big dump. One's strong.
Yes, one's quite negative.
And then in Luke, he goads them.
Can anyone please tell me, did Jesus choose the actual passage that he read, or was that given to him?
It was handed to him.
Interesting question. Yes, we know that that there was a lectionary that Jews have used throughout the centuries, like most churches use lectionaries these days, a lectionary of scripture. Now, the oldest part of that was the Torah, the first 5 books. So Isaiah is not part of that. Isaiah is part of the Nevi'im, the prophets. So the evidence is not clear as to whether there was both a Torah lectionary. There is today a Torah lectionary, that's the main lectionary, the Jews read through the first 5 books of the Bible every year, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And then they start again each year. But there's a secondary lectionary, the prophets. And then there are other books from the writings that are added in. So the evidence is not clear about whether there was a prophet's lectionary by this stage. Probably not universal, but so there's a hypothesis that maybe in Nazareth they were following a certain pattern, and this is just where it was up to, in which case it's hugely providential that this is the passage that Jesus gets to speak on. But the counter argument to that would be, well, Luke wasn't there. He is, in a good storyteller style, he's expanding the story, and he believes that this is the passage that marks Jesus' ministry. And so, of course, Jesus is going to read that passage. So whether the synagogue authorities chose the passage or Luke, the author, chose the passage is debated.
And Luke puts it after the baptism, so he's full of the Spirit.
Yeah. He's got a thing going on in chapter 4 about the Spirit, the Spirit, the Spirit. Well, that's actually a thing that's been from chapter 1 about the Spirit, Zechariah, the Spirit, Elizabeth, etc. Yeah.
And something that Mark puts in that Luke doesn't. Mark says his disciples followed him, that they talk about the son of Mary, his brothers and sisters, and his own kin all feature in the story, whereas in Luke's story, it's more Jesus as an individual.
All right, yeah.
They don't name the family in the same. He doesn't name family in the same way. Just the fact that it's his hometown.
But it's only the men that are named. The others are his sisters. No,
well, of course.
That's right. That's normal.
Not surprising.
Even yes. All right.
Well, I suppose it depends on what weight you give to Jesus takes the scroll and finds the place. Is it the place as what the lectionary reading is for that synagogue, or is it the place that says what he wants it to say? And it really all hangs on that.
My guess, given how big the synagogue and unwieldy the synagogue scrolls were, that it was probably pretty close to there that it was handed to him, because otherwise he would have had to scroll through sort of. There's only 66 chapters in Isaiah. If he was given it at the beginning, it would have taken a long time to get to the end.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. So is it the same story in Mark and Luke? Is it the same incident that is being told in a different way, or a different incidents?
I think it's the same incident.
That's the general consensus of scholarship, and it's the same incident which Luke is telling with a very different take from Mark, and also which Luke is putting at a very different place in the whole narrative compared to Mark. So this is part of Luke's ordering of the narrative. He's bringing it earlier, ahead of all of those things that are told in Mark's gospel. He's bringing it earlier to highlight it, to say this is a strategic moment. This is a key moment.
I don't know about ordering. Luke's editing of this incident might be a more correct term.
Okay, fair enough.
Don't think he's ordering Mark, he's rewriting it.
He's reordering Mark.
That's right.
All right, so you have in the material that should have come to you by email, you have the first part of the first part of the Mark story and the first part of the Luke story side by side, and we're going to go back into groups to explore how has Luke followed Mark and how has Luke modified Mark, and what explanation might you give to explain this? So we're thinking about how Luke is using Mark, modifying it, and for what purpose. So this needs to be probably a 10-minute time, I think, Elizabeth.
Sure. How did you go with the questions, Piers?
Well, I tended to sit back and listen to other people.
Okay.
To me, it does seem to me that we've got two descriptions which are different, but at the same time are really apply to the same event. I can't imagine, having been thrown out of Nazareth once, that he would be very keen to go back, except perhaps to visit his family.
Any other comments people want to make about this, about how Luke has changed Mark and why he might have done that?
Well, in the Mark event, you know, there's a question there after they heard him, they were astounded. They're saying, "Who is this person? You know, what wisdom has been given to him?" Whereas in the Luke one, straight after, you know, he rolls up the scroll, you know, then he kind of comes out and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." So he's kind of almost answering the question that Mark puts forward in the first place. One's questioning who it is, and the other one is pretty definitely about.
I find it very interesting in Luke where he kind of almost sabotages himself with telling them they'll have a go at him. He recognises that's reminds me what would have been a country town. It reminds me of country ministry. You know that people are reticent about putting themselves forward because of what everybody knows about them.
Very true. And you learn in country ministry, never talk about one member of the congregation to another one. They're always related. Any other comments about this? Because Luke does add a whole lot of stuff. As Sandy's pointed out, he adds the bit that provokes them. Any thoughts about that? Why Luke would want to do that?
The Mark thing doesn't make sense as it says. It stands. He went to the Sabbath, and and taught in the synagogue. People were astounded. They asked, where did he get the wisdom? What deeds of power have been done by his hands? Isn't this, you know, our local boy? All of these are positive things.
Yeah.
And then they took offence at him.
Then if you go on reading Luke, you find that they tried to kill him.
This is Mark I'm talking about. They all these positive things, and then he took offence. Whereas Luke, you follow through, and particularly if you keep reading, you understand exactly why they took offence.
Yeah, I guess it's tall poppy syndrome that Mark is describing. How could this person who is one of us, that's a carpenter's son or whatever they say, how could this person be like this? Not possible. Let's just insult him.
And that's that's really plausible. It feels historically accurate, factual sort of prosaic way of putting it. Whereas Luke's got an agenda that he wants to use for the rest of this story. And so he places this at this point, and it feels to me like the sort of Jewish midrash idea that he's grabbed some of the scripture and put it into his mouth, so that he can then lead on with the rest of the story, including the death threats and near misses and all that sort of stuff, which fits very well with the total Jesus yarn. That's why I find, from my own background, I find it much easier to read and understand Mark than I get confused and sent off on wild goose chases with Luke.
But Luke is the gospel that has Jesus saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, Peter, to do these things. And because of this, when you follow me and set up the church, you'll set up an agency like Uniting Care to do all of these things." Isn't he? Peter used to be.
I stand corrected by the preeminent mind of Reverend John Squires.
You've also got Luke, of course, as the universal gospel where everyone is a child of God, where if you read Mark and Matthew, it's not quite that straightforward.
Yet in Luke, why did Jesus say only one widow, only one leper? Has that got something to do with the fact that he didn't heal many people in Nazareth?
Oh, so he's equating himself with the...
Yes.
Maybe they're jealous. They wish he'd do more, but he hasn't done what they want for them.
Right.
Or something. I don't know.
You mean in Mark or in Luke?
No, in Luke.
In Luke
after this.
In Luke, Jesus is at pains to say that there was a severe famine, but only one widow at Zarephath was given provision, and only one leper was healed, Naaman the Syrian, and yet there were many lepers in Israel.
I think the point is they're Gentiles. The widow is the one that had the son die and was resurrected by Elisha, and the magic jar that the miracle with Elijah with the jar and the flour kept coming out of it. I think Jesus' point here is that the people that glorified God, that were and helped and aided the prophet, as it were, with the case of Elijah, and was obedient to the commands they were given in the case of Naaman, they were both Gentiles. I think that's the point. They weren't Israelites. So there were many lepers in Israel that weren't healed, but the Gentile leper was. And it's making a point about how God sees Gentiles and how God might see Israel's complacence. And that's what they seem to get really offended about.
Which is not surprising given
no
the general feeling. I mean, it's a bit like Australians. If you said to them, and it was the Afghani refugees that gave me food, not
you,
we would also get offended, I feel.
Yes. Yeah, it's that sort of thing. This only happened in Australia because, an ex-ISIS member actually converted to Christianity and set up a food kitchen. And nobody bothered to do it among the real Australians, kind of thing.
So if they're hearing it in that way, then that really explains verse 28 in Luke, doesn't it? When they heard
absolutely.
all in the synagogue were filled with rage. Not just disturbed in spirit, but filled with rage. So it's a very provocative selection. And in Jesus, in defense of Jesus, all he's doing is telling Jewish stories, but they're Jewish stories about minority situations, minority people.
And he's making a point about the fact that it's a minority person. There were lots of widows in Israel, but only this Gentile woman helped Elijah, the prophet.
I would think so, because Naaman wasn't that pleasant. If you know the story of Naaman, he was a fairly arrogant, narcissistic, unpleasant sort of king. Or no, he's a general or something like that.
General.
Politician.
Yeah, so he would be singled out in Jesus' observation of the one who was healed and not the ones of Israel who presumably would have been Jewish and following the Lord. I would be pretty offended by that, I think, if I heard it, because he really isn't a nice person.
No.
Yet it was the maid, wasn't it, the Israelite servant and the wife of Naaman who were key in that story, the women. And maybe it has that theme that Christ died for the unlovely or something. I don't know.
I'm not sure about that. I'd have to try and unpack that a little bit more. I mean, it happens because, the maidservant's trying to get, I suppose, something good to happen for Israel, and she thinks if the prophet comes and heals this person, then that may be the eventuality. And he just happens to be a pretty proud, unpleasant kind of person, and he refuses to do what he's asked initially. In the end, he gets desperate enough, and his servant convinces him he should try it. And of course, he's healed as a result. But he's a pretty offensive character to pick, I would have thought.
So Luke's Jesus is quite different from Mark's Jesus.
At this point, yes. Yes, he is.
So we best move on, because we're going to look also at chapter 5. You'll see in your in the resource material sent out, there's a whole lot of questions about the actual scripture passage that Jesus quotes and where it comes from, the way in which the figures in the story might be representative, and I think that's a fairly significant element, and the way, therefore, in which Luke is setting the scene for the ministry of Jesus by bringing this account forward to almost immediately after the baptism and temptation, by telling the story in great detail, by shaping it in this particular way. He's setting up the ministry of Jesus to be a certain thing. Now what we're going to do in the next story is look at something from the next chapter, which is where Jesus calls other people to join with him in that enterprise that is already set out in chapter 4. Yes, so we've got Luke 5 alongside of Mark 1, and you'll recognise that the same kind of dynamic is happening here. This is a story at one place in Mark's Gospel and another place in Luke's Gospel. So there's a set of questions here, which will just go back into groups, Elizabeth.
Yep, that's fine.
Reading Mark 1 and Luke 5, is it the same incident? Why do you think it is? What might be a problem for but it's the same incident? And then draw in the story from John 21, a similar story as in Luke 5, but at a very different place and at a very different time in another gospel.
Well, welcome back. And what have you discovered from reading Mark 1 and Luke 5? And if you got to John, looking at that as well, do you think it's the same story that's being told?
I think it is the same story being elaborated, but by Luke. But why he had to throw in a miracle, I'm not quite sure.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you've read the John chapter, you'll find that there's 3 different versions of the call of the disciples operating here. Yeah. And we have to assume it's the one thing being reported, because we have to assume that Jesus called the disciples and he didn't keep going back to recall them. That they were, it was a one-off event of some description.
The John chapter, the last chapter in John, is a post-resurrection story.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, the catch of fish certainly is.
And
it's referring to John's call of the disciples, which is different again.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting story, because I think it helps you to explain how the disciples, who must have been totally disillusioned when Jesus was crucified, to Galilee, and in the process of getting together, even if it was for fishing or whatever reason, and they talked to each other, they must have talked to each other over their breakfast, they suddenly realized that there was something in Jesus which had to continue.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, Piers, for that part of John, reading it that way.
Yeah, we thought that it was quite possible that that event may in fact have happened twice. And the reason that they were so sure that it was Jesus in John was because it had happened earlier.
Okay, what do you make of Mark then, and his call of the disciples? How does that fit with your theories?
Well, I mean, obviously the story of the fishing thing is constant, and I agree that Jesus didn't keep going back and calling people. They would keep coming. I mean, they came, and the tweaks are different. Mark didn't think this particular miracle was as important as the other miracles.
Did Mark know this miracle? We've got the same kind of picture of Jesus presented in both of these stories, and indeed in both of these Gospels.
Yes, and both of them are going to fish for people.
Well, they're both going to fish for people. They certainly have that in common, that Jesus is going to get them to fish for people. Although I probably want to contend if Mark knew this story, he would have included it. So what conclusion can you draw to why they're different? Why are they in different places in different times with different things happening?
Well, the thing that intrigues me about the Mark stories is it's at the very beginning. It's before he seems to have done any ministry work at all. He saw these people. These people saw Jesus on the shoreline, and they must have known about him. They must have known of what he was teaching about, and they must have speculated as to what he was going to do in the future. Were they expecting him to get rid of the Roman rulers and Herod Antipas, so that there would be a self-contained, self-ruling state again?
They're all good questions, Piers. I don't know that we've got answers, because how many of you, if some bloke hoved into view while you were about your business and said, "Follow me," would drop what you were doing and just go?
No, I don't think they would.
That would be none.
We'd need.
That's why I think they must have had some contact with him earlier.
And they need some kind of proof.
They would need some evidence. Yes, David, you have your hand up.
Oh, well, well, it's not evident, it's implied that when they respond master, that they have had some previous contact with him. But also, I wonder about whether it's a linear narrative, whether it starts in one place and just continues in time, because it says, you know, one Sabbath, and the start of this chapter, this section says once while Jesus was standing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be all in order. A lot of the chapters start off, you know, one day as Jesus was standing while Jesus is in one of the towns. After this, it doesn't go then, and put it into a sequence. So that's one possibility.
But this is another part of Luke's ordering or pre-ordering of stuff. In that, in Mark's gospel, we have Jesus proclaiming the kingdom, and then calling the disciples. And then later on, he goes into Simon Peter's house and heals his mother-in-law. Whereas in Luke's gospel, we've had Jesus going around teaching in all the synagogues, going to Nazareth. Then he goes to Simon's house and heals Simon's mother-in-law. Then he preaches in more synagogues. And then once, says Luke, while Jesus was standing beside the lake, he is engaged with the crowd, not just the disciples, but the crowd. And he says in verse 3, he got into the boat belonging to Simon. There's a pre-existing relationship with Simon because he's already there early in the chapter, Simon. And he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. And what is he teaching? Now, Luke doesn't tell us what he's teaching, but we might assume that what he was preaching in chapter 4 as part of the teaching in chapter 5. So the call, the miracle and the call is then placed into a really understandable context of prior relationship, prior understanding, prior knowledge, and therefore let's go with it now. Now we can call them to catch it.
And the miracle's the icing on the cake of that, because they've got this prior relationship, they understand what Jesus is teaching, and then just in case you were still unconvinced, we've got this miraculous catch that will symbolize the disciples and their catch of people, if you like, that just clinches the deal. Where Mark is probably, you've got to build a lot of assumptions into Mark that aren't put into the text.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Luke seems to be saying Mark doesn't tell this story very well. No one can understand why it happened because he hasn't given you the important details.
No, he hasn't. Mark's just said, Jesus said, follow me, and they dropped everything and went. Now, Jesus either has some compelling mystical power to make people just obey his authority, or Mark has left out an awful lot of details about prior relationships and why they'd want to do that. And Luke corrects that.
Exposition.
Do you think Mark was in a hurry to get his gospel written because he was trying to persuade his congregation to dash off to Jerusalem to defend Jerusalem against the Romans? So he missed out a lot of things because he didn't have time to write them down.
Well, possibly. It's hard to say, Piers, because we don't know exactly when it was written, and we don't know the exact purpose Mark may have had in mind. He certainly never states that purpose. But you can't rule it out definitively, but neither can I rule it in definitively. But it's possible.
No, well, I'm only putting it forward as a possibility. I realise we can't answer these questions. We can't interview Mark.
No, we can't. And the fact that there's no ending to his gospel suggests to me that he did run out of time somewhere along the line. And it was unfinished. I don't believe Mark ended it with the existential angst that modern day scholars want to attribute to him, because that was just unknown in the ancient world. Gwyn and Gary, you have your hand up.
I'm not sure whether I'm just being a smarty pants here, but in my observation in the writing styles of Luke and Mark, Luke writes more like a woman in that he will put in the details, the nitty-gritty, the interesting little side bits, whereas Mark is just cutting to the chase. These are the facts. This is it. Luke's more like, well, you might
like it all numbered.
The only thing that would probably question your hypothesis there, and I'm fond of pointing this out to people, is Mark adds an incredible amount of flowery detail to certain stories he tells. The story of the demoniac, for instance. You get this description in Mark that goes for verse after verse after verse. which Matthew and Luke just chop right down. If you have a look at the stilling of the storm, that particular miracle, there's all sorts of extra details that's been put into that by the Gospel of Mark, including Jesus on a cushion, which is just missing from the other Gospels. So I think gospel writers are all capable of enlarging events that take their fancy.
Maybe at the time when the story was being written by Mark, because it's quite early or early-ish compared to the other Gospels, there were assumptions that people might have already known these things, that it wasn't quite as important to put in as much detail.
That's quite possible too,
It
I
would have
think,
been
Bill.
more common knowledge that.
Yeah.
So I don't need to repeat that because people know that sort of stuff, and I've got economy with my words. So let's get straight to the chase and say, follow me.
I think that's quite possible because I think there was an oral tradition that was going since the time of Jesus. A lot of these stories would have been well known. So gospel writers can write taking it for granted that that backfill, if you like, will be known by the audience to which they are writing. So, yeah, I'd agree with that.
So for the last 5 minutes, can we jump to the last verse?
Yes.
Or verse 10, the penultimate verse. Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you'll be catching people. People from Tuggeranong that have done previous Bible studies must know what this means. Do not be afraid.
Yes, do not be afraid. What does that mean? And it ties in with Peter falling to prostrate in the bottom of the boat. What does it mean? How is Jesus being portrayed here? Who else says do not be afraid in the Bible? Let me take you back to basics.
God says that to Moses.
God says it to Moses, yep.
All the angels.
All the angels. Every time an angel turns up, they always say do not be afraid. So banish those Michelangelo paintings of fluffy cherubs from your minds, because clearly angels were very scary creatures if they always had to say do not be afraid.
Mary, Elizabeth, all of them.
Yep, that's right. Do not be afraid. So
I think I'd be afraid if suddenly somebody appeared in the room that I was sitting in.
He doesn't necessarily manifest like some ghostly apparition, but there is all this do not be afraid that happens. So when you get that, it's a signal of what? What is it signaling is actually happening to the person?
God's messenger.
Yeah, well, they're in the presence of something divine, aren't they? So when Jesus says do not be afraid, it's signaling you that Jesus is being portrayed as a divine messenger of God at this point. And we know that he is because what does Peter do?
Do not be
sinful man.
Yep, down on his knees, prostrate in the boat, which help us, what was in the bilge of that boat? Down he goes and he says, go away.
Yes.
Go away, because I am a sinful man. Why do you think he might be doing that?
He's terrified.
He is terrified.
Well, he recognises that Jesus is not just an ordinary human being. There's something out of this world.
Yes, there is something out of this world.
That's right.
Absolutely. And why does he say I'm a sinful man? What comparisons might we make with that? Who else says that?
Is it Isaiah or one of I'm a man?
Being called.
Yes, it is Isaiah who says, woe unto me, or some such thing according to the King James. I am a sinful man, and I am from a man, I have unclean lips, and I come from a people with unclean lips, Isaiah says in chapter 6.
In fact, the lectionary has made that decision for us, because last Sunday, the gospel reading was this passage, Luke 5, and the Hebrew scripture passage was Isaiah 6.
Yes, indeed.
The lectionary has put them side by side deliberately.
And we find with call narratives, because this is a call narrative, that often the person being called says, I'm not up to the task. So there's that point. Peter's afraid and he's saying, but he says, go away. He doesn't just say, I'm not up to this task. He says, actually, go away. We need to look at the prophet Elijah again for this one. People told prophets to go away. That widow that's fated in chapter 4 of Luke by Jesus as being the one that was saved when the famine was there. When Elijah hoves into view, she recognises him as a holy man, tells him to nick off. And the reason that people do that is because holy people, or holy men, they're all holy men at that point, Holy men had the eye of God on them because they were holy. That's right. God was always looking at them. And of course, if you're in the presence of a holy man, God was probably looking at you. And so hence Peter's cry, oh no, I am a sinful man in the presence of a holy man. And that means God's looking at me and he's going to know all the rotten things that I've done in the last 10 years. Nick off. I don't need this stress in my life. I am not risking God looking at me and punishing me for all my sins. And that's why Jesus then needs to respond, do not be afraid. You're going to come and work with me and catch people. So Luke is building a very good knowledge of the Hebrew scripture into this story, apart from anything else, which Mark doesn't and Luke does. That tradition of story in the Hebrew Bible is really important here in the Gospel of Luke. And there's all sorts of interesting little facets of that tradition that's popping up in this story of the call of the disciples.
Actually, kind of interesting how much effort Luke puts into helping people to see how Jesus fits in with Hebrew scripture, when the agreement is that he probably wasn't writing to a Jewish audience as such. He obviously was writing to some Jews.
Yeah, and he's writing for I think he's probably writing for a mixed community, but he's writing with an eye to the tradition. We know in Roman times, an invented religion would be given very little truck, but a religion rooted in tradition that could claim that its roots went back hundreds of years, which much more well regarded. So that's probably another facet of this particular writing as well, that he is rooting it in there so it has respectability and credibility as a religion.
You think he was writing for God-fearers who had become associated with the synagogues? Because he spends quite a bit, at least Paul spends a bit of time in Luke's description in Acts, that he spent time talking to the synagogues with trying to attract the God-fearers.
Yeah.
It's possible, but I think by the time Luke is writing, and remember Luke wrote Acts, by the time Luke is writing, the Gentile church is probably pretty well established. So I don't think it's just God-fearers either that we're dealing with, though they're clearly there because Luke mentions them a lot in Acts. But I think it's Gentiles generally that he's including. It's not just God-fearers.
But do you think it's not, I mean, we look back on Christianity as a separate, different religion. Do you think at that stage he was still saying, this is actually the Messiah, this is Judaism, this is...
Yeah,
this
probably.
is the right way to be Jewish.
At the early stages, I think he's writing it more historically than he is that's what's going on. Though we know that what we call Christianity was operating as a sect within Judaism in pockets of the empire for most of the first century. And clearly Matthew sees himself as under the discipline of the law and the synagogues because he tells you that in chapter 10 and in chapter 23. And John tells you 3 times they were expelled from the synagogue. So clearly it wasn't the Johannine community's choice that they stop going to synagogue and stop being Jewish. They're told to leave. So it's a fine line between what is a Jewish sect and what then crosses into what in effect becomes a new religion.
So I have in my possession a series of letters recently discovered that Theophilus wrote to Luke, which addressed this precise question, which I plan to put on my blog over a series of days. So I'll give you the links to them and you can read and ponder as we go throughout the course about what Theophilus might have thought.
Just to be clear, John is writing this, not Theophilus.
I found them. They were dug up in the backyard. And
they were not dug up in your backyard. They were dug up in your typewriter.
They were dug up in the backyard in Canberra, so they were definitely written by Theophilus.
Well, they were actually while I was still at UTC, so they were written 20 years ago. But I'm going to use them for that purpose, to think about who Luke is writing to.
Well, a bit about his daughter.
That means they're ancient.
That's basically our time for today, folks. Next week, we are moving on to look at the gospel passage that's in the lectionary this coming Sunday, and the Sunday after. So there's two parts of it. It's the Sermon on the Plain and the call to radical discipleship. So in preparation for next week, if you want to read that sermon, it's Luke 6 from verse 17 through to the end of the chapter, verse 49.